One of the primary duties of a powerlifting coach is to be a creative problem solver. When a situation arises, our goal is to figure out a solution for it. And within training and dealing with complex systems such as a human being, there's a lot of variables that go into play. And so there's a lot of data and tracking and things that we're constantly trying to do to try and figure out, okay, we have this issue, what can we do to solve it? And so what I want to cover in today's video is what I consider the 3 biggest questions I've had as a powerlifting coach. And these have taken years to be able to find the answers to, because when I first started out coaching, I've been in this industry for a while. I've probably been in some type of fitness related work for the past about 12 years. I've been coaching powerlifters in some capacity for the last 6 or 7 years, and the last 4 years been completely full-time coaching only powerlifters. So when I first got into it, I felt like I had a good understanding from like book knowledge. I mean, I still to this day, I read everything, I watch everything, every single thing I can get my hands on, I'm constantly trying to learn from. And that gets you to a really good point. That gets you a solid foundation of knowledge, but really kind of what takes you over the edge is the experience. Now, I would say there's one other aspect that really is helpful is if you hire a coach on your own. For anyone who's hired a coach that is a very great coach, you learn a lot from them, from kind of the mentoring process, but nothing can just replace experience and being able to have 35 athletes that get to be guinea pigs in some way. That doesn't mean just testing random things on them, but we see different problems arise within these 35 athletes. And as my coach, I have the ability to be able to try different things to be able to creatively problem solve and find solutions within their training. So with these 3 questions, these are the ones that, I mean, really haunted me at times. Like I really just didn't quite know the answer. And it's taken a while to be able to figure these out, to be able to where I could say that I really have a solid foundation of, okay, here's the issue and here's what we can do to alleviate this. And it didn't mean I was a bad coach before. I think a lot of people who might be coaches who are watching this probably have the same questions. These are not easy questions to answer. And they're very complex, yet they're very simple at the same time. And that's kind of what really kind of comes down to kind of be able to answer these questions. Is I had to take really complex creative problem solving to find simple solutions that could be able to make training and solving these issues repeatable and predictable. So what are these questions? What are these problems we're trying to solve? Number 1, is the current progress we're seeing in a training block due to the current block or from previous blocks? Question number 2, does a lifter need more volume or less volume? And then question number 3, how many top sets versus back off sets does a lifter need? Or another way to be able to put it is kind of what's the average intensity that they should be training at on certain days. So what I hope to do within this video is 1, be able to give a little bit more detail about exactly what these questions mean. And just that 1 sentence question I stated, those sound fairly simple, but when we dig deeper into those are fairly complex issues that coaches and lifters deal with on a regular basis. And I want to give a little bit more insight of kind of the extent of what those questions span. Second, I want to give the fix. I want to tell you the answer of what I've found that have really been able to answer those questions on a predictable and repeatable process that I can then not only problem solve for one lifter, but be able to problem solve for the majority of my lifters and be able to figure out how we can be able to manipulate and change variables within their training to be able to fix these issues and find solutions. And then number 3, if you watch my channel, this is something I typically do because I want to be able to give you real life examples, is I'm going to be pulling up training of some of my athletes to be able to show exactly how we implemented some of these fixes and solutions into their training and kind of how that played out, so you can get a good idea of kind of how this actually works on paper, or in the sense of us nowadays within Google Sheets. So getting right into it, let's go back to question 1. Question 1 is the current progress we're seeing in this block due to the current block, or is it due to prior blocks? And where this really arises is a common issue you'll see is you'll have this great block. It went amazing. You had all these PRs. You're like, oh, we found it. This is the perfect formula. We just got to keep doing this. And so you try to repeat what you did in that block, and then it just doesn't really work again. And there's a good chance that something you did prior to that block is actually what created the adaptation, and the strength realization just happened within that block. Or you might even have a block that went really well, but you just didn't know it went well. You saw later on that things were better and better, and you just didn't realize that that block 3 months ago is really kind of the foundation for what occurred later on. So within training, it's constantly trying to figure out, is what I'm doing right now what is optimal, or is what I did in the past led to this block now being able to realize this strength? And so that was a question I struggle with of like, is the current training what's working, or is it the training in totality what's working, or is it prior training that's worked and now we're just kind of finally seeing the strength come to the forefront because of light variables or the current training block, or whatever it may be. And so the answer to this issue is structure must precede periodization. So what I mean by that is we have to be able to find out the, in sense, optimal weekly structure and block structure, or we could say microcycle or mesocycle for a lifter before we start periodizing their training. We need to figure out an individual block that works and then be able to manipulate variables within that structure before we can be able to periodize and be able to be a little bit more fancy in the sense of kind of what we think is hypertrophy blocks, strength blocks, and peaking blocks and whatnot. You see that a lot with kind of the emerging strategies approach. Is the emerging strategies approach is let's take this block and let's see progress within this block. And while I don't necessarily follow emerging strategies, I think that's a really good kind of starting point. When I get a new athlete, what I'm trying to do is not trying to just put them into a periodized structure and let's start with the volume block, then let's go to that kind of stuff. It's let's figure out the weekly structure and let's figure out the block structure. And then once we've got that, then we can start manipulating variables, periodizing training, and have a much better base of what we need to do within a microcycle, mesocycle, macrocycle, long-term planning, all that kind of stuff to be able to lead into the best results. And that's why I think a lot of coaches lately have gotten a little bit away from the typical periodization. And that's partially because we have to take a step back and just figure out block structure first before we can ever worry about periodization and seeing the benefits of periodization. Or else we're just going to go back to square one, which is, did this actually work, this block? Or was this just the fruition of past blocks? Or you just have no idea what's actually working. We need to know what works first before we then start manipulating things. So one thing I would recommend is if you want a little bit more background on kind of setting up a weekly structure, I do have a full video talking about kind of writing out your weekly training split. So I definitely give this a view, or give that a view if you haven't seen it before, for a little bit more background. But with that, let's kind of jump into things. I've got two lifters we're gonna go through. One is an athlete I just recently started coaching. So we're gonna kind of take a look at kind of how those first three blocks we did together progressed, as well as a lifter I've coached for a very long time. And we very much figured out kind of his optimal structure, as well as we figured out a very distinct way we manipulate his bench press, where we see for about 2 blocks or so, we actually suppress his strength and go kind of high stress. And then when we pull that block and go to a different structure, we see kind of that strength come through that lasts for about 2 blocks before it kind of peaks and plateaus before we got to kind of rerun this. So kind of give 2 examples of kind of what I mean here by we have to, 1, find the weekly and block structure, and then 2, how we manipulate that afterwards to kind of be able to see the differences in block structure and how some things are working in the present and how some things are working because of past trainings. All right, so looking at the first example here, we have Autumn. As I mentioned, I just recently started coaching her, and if we're looking at kind of the layout here, I'm not going to give a crazy full detail, but more kind of the gist of things. We've got 3-day-a-week squat frequency, as you can see, and then we started out just deadlifting once a week. And actually, we actually did originally, we're only going to do a top set every other week. I did eventually change that where she did a top set on this week 3, but it was a bit more suppressed and low intensity. And the reason why is she had a she did and does have a very finicky deadlift. It is very sensitive to intensity and volume. So I actually pulled her back to just once a week frequency. And for squat, I actually upped her frequency and volume, mainly because before working with me, she had mentioned that she had never really felt like her legs were ever fatigued or sore or overtrained. She said she had plenty left in the tank, so we bumped it up. And then bench here, we did once a week frequency. So I'm not going to talk as much about bench, because kind of what we set up with bench worked. Like we got things working from the get-go. We saw repeatable results, and we've kind of stuck with a similar structure. It was squat and deadlift though that we had to change. Really what we found on squat is after that first block, she was very, very fatigued on Wednesdays. And this is actually going to be something we're going to talk about eventually when it comes to more or less volume. But we found she was very fatigued on Wednesdays. And by the end of the block, she was having a little bit of knee pain. And And so she was just feeling a lot more beat up than she had in the past. So that was kind of giving me an idea of, okay, maybe this is a tad too much and a bit over what she can be able to recover from. On deadlift, it was kind of the opposite. Strength wasn't great, but she also wasn't super fatigued. She had mentioned to me that she just didn't feel super practiced from only having once a week frequency. So going into the second block, we made some adjustments. We went into twice a week frequency for deadlift, and we went to twice a week frequency for squat. And we also had a little bit of a drop in volume. So you can see here, 5 sets on day 2, 5 sets on the primary day. If we're looking back at the last block, we had 3, 5, and 5. So it was actually a 3-set total drop, and really it was mainly just because we took out that tertiary day, and we didn't even reallocate that volume. I just considered that to be too much, so we pulled that tertiary day, and right away, squat went amazing. So we made some adjustments. Squat was much, much better on this block. The only thing though, and why I can't say that the structure was perfect yet for her squat, is because her squat and her deadlift tend to carry similar fatigue. So we have to kind of find a happy medium here. And why this block structure was not yet like perfected per se, and something we're going to continue to roll with, and we still need a little bit more experimentation, is on deadlift. You can see here, we separated. We had conventional deadlifts on one day, and we had RDLs on the other. So we separated that versus having all on one day, but we kept volume similar. From there, we actually started out pretty light and we ramped up. But it was actually probably too quick of a ramp, because what we found is week 3, she actually peaked. She felt pretty good here. And then week 4, you can see, she actually just didn't do very good. She went to go, I think, pull 365 or 375 or something like that, and it just wouldn't even budge. And oddly enough, so one of the things about her finicky deadlift is that she pulls conventional and sumo, and they're similar strength. She actually ended up pulling sumo this day and hit 395 for 2, but conventional could barely move off the floor, which is going to come back next block of kind of the things we're going to be doing here. So basically what I gathered here is we had a much better structure for squat. This twice a week frequency was much more predictable. We saw better strength. We saw better progress. We just needed to make a couple adjustments to her deadlift because we just peaked it too early. Basically like I said, she's very intensity sensitive, and you can see here, 360, 365, 375. There's not big jumps each week. It was pretty it was pretty close jumps. And so what I decided is we need to have bigger jumps each week in the sense of kind of ramping a bit more. So moving into the next block, and we can actually see here some things because she hasn't finished this block completely yet. So we're going to have to see how it plays out, but I've got high hopes for it, is we started at a very low RPE. So you can see by week 4, we're at the 7.5 to 8 RPE, the same RPE that I had planned for this week 4 to be at. But from there, we have a big drop off. I mean, 6.5 on week 3. I believe it was 5.5 on week 2 and 4.5 on week 1, which is almost hard to be able to kind of know what a 4.5 RPE is, but that's also why I tend to give those ranges if you've watched my other videos. So starting out very light, allowing those adaptations to occur before then we progressively overload. That's something, if you follow me on Instagram, I've talked about. That's something Sean Noriega talks about a lot, is let the adaptations precede overload. And here, what we see probably a bit too much is the adaptations didn't occur. We overloaded too quick, and then she fatigued out and didn't have a great week 4. So we're going to keep this a little bit easier, allow the adaptations, the repeated bout effects to happen, and then we start ramping up intensity weeks 3 and 4. It's kind of the main change we did. The second change we did, just because of how her sumo and conventional seem to not really correlate to each other. If one's doing really well and one's bad, then the other one's usually not very good. Where if the other one's really good, the other one's not great. I wanted to keep a little bit of sumo in there just so it was a little bit easier to be able to transition if we ever wanted to, since they're kind of going back and forth on each other. So what I did here is on Thursdays, we did some very light sumo pause deadlift clusters. That should be very low fatigue. That should also not add too much to the fatigue bucket that is conventional deadlift. Because like I said, her sumo and her conventional don't tend to share the same fatigue. I don't think they necessarily help each other. This is just a way to get a little bit more deadlift practice in the opposite stance. So that if we want to switch back on the stance, we can. But my hope is as well that this doesn't fatigue too much. And I don't want to say it's a volume drop, but it almost kind of is a little bit of a volume drop in the sense of kind of how it affects conventional deadlift. And then we kept in at least one set of RDLs there for some more kind of isolated hinge-based movements. So yeah, so we can see here, we started out 3 times a week squatting, 1 time a week deadlifting. Didn't work. So then we backed off to twice a week squatting, and then we went to twice a week deadlifting. Worked a lot better, but we saw that deadlift peaked out too quick. So now we're adjusting intensity and the ramping of the week. So starting out more submaximal weeks 1 and 2, and then we're ramping out faster weeks 3 and 4. And then hopefully what we're going to find is that this block structure works really well. We find that the primary days are strong, and they're strong when we want them to be, not only on this Monday workout for deadlift, but we want it to be the strongest on week 4. We want the squat to be strongest on week 4 on Wednesday. And then bench, we've already found Tuesday is very strong, and we don't need to change anything because it's been very, very predictable. So if we find that this block structure works and it's very consistent throughout this, and it goes as planned and it's predictable and it goes as expected. From here, we start to periodize a bit more, which is going to be helpful because the next 2 blocks are leading into Raw Nationals. This is kind of our final block to be able to experiment where we really kind of need to solidify something, and I'm pretty sure we will. So this was going to be allow us to solidify kind of the block structure in sense of the microcycle and the weekly structure. Obviously, you can see that's changed. Even the days she does some of the lifts has changed from block 1. You can see her primary squat day used to be on Saturday. Now it's on Wednesday because of moving things around. Monday, she tends to be more motivated coming off the weekend. So I wanted to put deadlifts there instead of having them originally on a Thursday. She just tends to be really excited for training on Monday. So let's put the lift that is doing the worst in sense on the day she's most motivated and most excited. So lots of little changes to the microcycle and the mesocycle block structure to be able to find this kind of set structure that we can then periodize after. So looking at then someone I've coached for a while and the structure we've come to find that works is Joey. So Joey, we already know what works on bench. He does 6 total sets on his primary day. He does 5 total sets on his secondary day, and he does 5 total sets on his tertiary day in this Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday setup. As well as, kind of oddly, we only comp bench 1 day and we Larson the other 2. We found anytime we comp bench twice a week, it just doesn't go as well. He gets the best progress when we Larson twice a week and comp bench once a week. And obviously here you can see a little bit of variation. Within that though, then is where we manipulate. So we know he needs to Larson twice a week. We know he needs comp benches once a week, whether it's on the primary or the secondary day. His primary day is Monday. We know the total set count and the volume. From there, we can kind of manipulate things. So this is kind of the structure we follow for Joey. We do 2 blocks of what I call high stress and kind of suppresses strength, where we actually see strength not do very well. And these are these 2 blocks. And then we do a block where we pull back average intensity, and we kind of allow ourselves to realize that strength within the same structure. So looking at this, Monday, Joey has a top set, and that's building up and ramping each week. But one of the biggest things here, and this is something I'll cover later on in regards to question 3, is we have these fatigue drop sets. And you can see here, he is able to repeat this load that's only backed off at 6%. He repeats that until it's a 6 RPE. He has the same thing on his secondary day as well. He has 4 total back off sets, backs off 6%. And he does as many as he can to a 6 RP. And what you can actually see here is usually week 1, you can see he's getting most of those sets. This tertiary day we keep easy, backs off 10%, always keeping that 1 top set and then 4 back offs. And what you'll see here is this is very predictable. Happens every block we do this. And I actually made a change the block after this to kind of do something a little bit different that actually worked better. But we've done this structure multiple times now. And what you can see is, okay, 3 and 2, 4 and 0, 2 and 3, 3 and 1. 1 and 4, 2 and 2, 1 and 4, 2 and 2. You can see as he progresses, he starts to accumulate fatigue and he can't handle that same average intensity and he has to back off more. These things get harder quicker. And one thing he also notes is when we do this structure, that Saturday tertiary day tends to feel fairly fatigued as well. And what I actually did, because you can see here, he gets 3, 2, 1, 1, and then basically settles in 2 here. I basically realized he tends to just get 2 sets. And so since I've coached him so long, I actually kind of went away for this fatigue drop model. And for another high stress block, I set it up so that we had the same back off, this 6% back off, and then another 6% back off. But it is 2 sets. It's just stable throughout. And we actually found that this was more predictable, even though it was high stress. And he didn't hit any PRs this block. And we knew he wouldn't. We knew it was going to be something where he had an okay block. These numbers aren't bad, but they weren't PR strength. Then going into this current block, we're literally already seeing PR strength. And what we did here, you can see we have a top set and then we back off. We back off 8%. So it's already planned to back off of a decent amount. Here we back off 10% plus another 6% due to the rep drop. And then here we're backing off the normal amount too. So it's very much just a lower average intensity on all these back offs. We don't have this fatigue drop to be able to accumulate higher intensity on the back offs. It's just a very easy top set and then easy volume for him. And then already, I mean, I think this was either at a PR or a PR already for a set of 5 at 285. And I very much assume he's going to beat that in week 4. And this is exactly what we see over and over with Joey, is that we do these 2 blocks that are high stress. It suppresses strength. We know the amount that he can tolerate, though. If we did too much, we could actually risk injury, which is going to talk about a little bit about in the more or less volume. But we know this is kind of his threshold of where he's able to go 4 weeks. It suppresses strength a bit, but we don't see a strength drop off. We just see him training under high fatigue. We do that for 2 blocks, and then we go to this low fatigue style where we emphasize more that peak intensity and then lower average intensity for the back offs. We do this for about 2 blocks. We end up hitting some big PRs, but if we keep doing it, it starts tailing off and he just kind of plateaus. It's like it's not enough of a stimulus. So we just kind of go back and forth between these blocks. We do 2 high stress, 2 peak intensity, 2 high stress, 2 peak intensity. And it's worked like clockwork that we're able to continue to see the same predictable results over and over. But that was preceded by finding the structure in the first place. The structure didn't work until we realized he should Larson bench twice a week. The structure didn't work until we realized that he was continually getting fatigued out by these fatigue drop sets, and that was actually suppressing strength. So it wasn't until we pulled back that we could actually realize the strength. So there was a lot of structure issues that we had to figure out first before we really periodized it and kind of set this to be able to manipulate the variables within. So question 2. Does a lifter need more or less volume? And I would say this is probably the question that people are most familiar with. This is the age-old question. Do they need more or they need less? And I think just the general consensus for a while there was, okay, they need more. A lot of people fell into this volume trap. And I think that's because in the general sense of like, if we think we want to get better, we think we need to work harder. But working harder doesn't always mean more. It sometimes means working smarter and doing better quality versus more quantity. So it doesn't mean that there isn't times of more volume being needed, but there is just as many times as I see less volume being needed. And I, as a coach, definitely fell into that trap of thinking anytime someone kind of stalled out or plateaued or they weren't making progress, they probably just need more. And that definitely wasn't the case. That led to more issues often than not. And so what I really found out was through time of kind of seeing these signs and markers that lifters kind of show within their training of what would delineate needing more volume and what would show more that they actually need less volume in the sense of kind of optimizing their program to make sure that they're recovering and they're the strongest when they need to be, and we can find that predictability and consistency week to week. So let's start with less volume. What are some signs or markers that I see for needing less volume? And I'm going to run through them really quick and explain them a bit more. Is one, just some inconsistent primary days. Like we have this primary day that we assume is going to be the strongest each week, and it just kind of isn't. Like sometimes it's kind of fatigued, especially maybe later in the block. Another one is aches and pains and injuries. Injuries come up because of doing more than our body can handle. So if we're pushing those upper limits of workload, probably one of the biggest signs of doing too much is those injuries continually reoccurring. I'll explain that a little bit more in a second here. The next one is inconsistent peak weeks. And I use this peak week term in the sense of like if there's a training block and you're running 4 weeks, that 4th week is the week we're trying to be the strongest, in the sense the week we're peaking, not in the sense of like a meet peak, but in the sense of a block peak. If it's really inconsistent, sometimes they're fatiguing out beforehand, as I kind of mentioned. It's possible they're doing too much. And then for those who have been following my channel, if you've watched my deloading video, you know I'm a fan of deloads. And one of the reasons for this is that if you find a lifter continually coming off a deload feeling amazing and super strong, and it's like their best week of training, and then that kind of tapers off, like each week after is just not as good. They're getting weaker, they're feeling more fatigued, but then you deload and then boom, week 1 feels amazing. That's another sign that you're doing too much, because it's after you taper off all of that work and you recover, you finally feel good, but then you go back into this fatigue and this kind of masking period where you don't feel great and strength is suppressed, which again, going back to like the Joey example, there's times for that to an extent, but for the most part, we're wanting to come off of a deload fresh, but we shouldn't be our strongest there. We should be strongest after the adaptation and the overload occurs. So coming back around to some of those points, with injuries, it's powerlifting. we're not going to be perfectly injury free, even if we have the most perfect training plan ever, because as humans, we're variable. Recovery, sleep, eating, life stress, lots of different things like that. What worked in the past may not work now, may not work this block, but works the next block. There's so many different things. So just because someone gets injured doesn't mean they're doing too much. It's if it becomes chronic and predictable. If it's chronic, meaning it just never goes away and they're constantly having this pain or this issue, that's kind of an issue. That means they're doing too much of something, or something's wrong that we need to change. But that could be very much a sign and an indicator that they're doing too much volume on a particular lift. The other one is it becomes predictable. If every single training block by weeks 3 and 4, their knee starts bugging them, it's very possible, especially if that lines up with some of the other points of like maybe we see kind of a decrease in strength or high fatigue. But if every single time their knee starts hurting by week 3 or 4, yeah, there's something wrong there. It sounds like they're reaching too high of fatigue and they're going past their kind of baseline workload that they can tolerate and their kind of maximal recoverable volume, and then they're starting to have this little ache and pain every block. It means usually if it's just kind of tolerable and they can get through it, that you're probably just pushing past that threshold and they're just barely over it, versus like the chronic pain where it very well could affect training. It means you're probably definitely over it. But injuries are definitely a good marker. It's almost kind of a thing sometimes where if you want to increase volume, if you increase it and you kind of see, okay, we're starting to see some aches and pains onset predictably. Okay, that's my limit. Now let's back off a little bit. We increased volume, but we did a little too much. And then the one other thing I really want to cover there is going back to kind of the primary day. If that's inconsistent, it's because something within the weekly structure or even the block structure is just not setting that day up to be the best day, because the fatigue patterns are kind of messed up. And that doesn't mean necessarily we need less volume. Maybe we need to adjust the weekly structure. But I think the bigger tell is if we're seeing kind of later in the block, we're always starting to suppress strength and coming off that deload, you're feeling really good. That's a decent marker that you're probably doing a little bit more than you recover from. And it might not always be the primary day. It could even be the secondary day. If the secondary day is always just trash, which we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about an example of that. If it's just always terrible, even if the primary day feels good, if the secondary always feels terrible, maybe there's some greener grass on the little bit lower volume there to make sure that secondary day can be decent as well, because we don't want it to be just terrible. We want it to be under some fatigue, but it should still be a productive training session. Now, on the opposite end, there are lifters who need more volume, and some kind of markers or indicators of that is that they're always feeling fresh. That's a pretty obvious one. They just never feel fatigued. They always feel fresh. But kind of what comes with that is that not only do they feel fresh, but there's some other kind of things that kind of carry along, such as they feel kind of laggy. Like when they get into the session, they feel really recovered, but then all of a sudden the weight just feels really heavy on their back or in their hands. And they're like, I thought this was going to be a good session, but it just felt kind of felt bleh. And they might describe it as not feeling very explosive. They might describe it as almost just kind of feeling tired. And that's almost kind of an indication of understimulation. The other big sign is coming off of a deload. And again, another check mark for why I like deloads, because it helps a lot with being able to kind of find this data when some other times you can't, is coming off of a deload if they actually feel like terrible that week. In a sense of like they feel over recovered, they feel really laggy. We see a big strength dip. They definitely don't feel fatigued. They just feel really laggy, like they taken time off of training. And then we see a big uptick come like week 2 and 3, and maybe by weeks 3 and 4, because there's not enough volume, they aren't really continuing to progress too much. But at least weeks 1 and 2, week 2 all of a sudden feels great, and what they should feel like coming off of a deload, where week 1 coming off of the deload feels detrained, it feels laggy, it doesn't feel explosive, everything just kind of feels heavy and they're feeling tired and overly fresh. And so before getting examples, much like I'm going to plug some other stuff because it helps to kind of make me not have to make a 2-hour video on this, but have some other resources, is I did make a video, or I wrote an article on kind of what I consider the 3 feelings of training. And this is kind of more from the athlete perspective, and it to be able to help to make sure you give your coach the right feedback so that they can kind of be able to get these signs and indicators of needing more or less volume. And I'll link that in my bio, but I definitely give a read of that because it's going to kind of break down the feelings of what it feels to be kind of laggy, what it feels to be prepared, which is what we want, and what it would kind of feel like to feel fatigue. So make sure to give that a listen. So for looking at the example, I'm going to use the same lifter for both of more and less volume, because we saw the actual opposite occurring on his bench versus his squat. And this was with Sean leading into his meet in February with his bench versus his squat. So let's first kind of look at bench. So most of you are probably familiar with Sean, and he benches 5 days a week. He benches a lot. And a lot of volume and a lot of high reps and a lot of sets. So it's a fairly complicated process. But within that, he's been doing this for a long time. He is a very knowledgeable person. He gives amazing feedback as an athlete. And so it's really easy to kind of have these indicators because he makes sure all his ducks are in a row with all the variables. So in the second to last block leading into the meet, he just kept telling me he felt kind of over recovered. Like he felt like recovered every session, but he didn't feel strong. And we actually started kind of seeing things kind of taper off to where even by the final week, you can see here, he just kept hitting 220 over and over and over. And it really just wasn't getting any better. Like he wasn't weak, but he wasn't getting stronger. And he was telling me by the end, he's like, I just don't think it's enough stimulus. Like I know what it should feel like, because he actually has a very specific marker. And I do not recommend this for most people. This is something for Sean, who literally is a robot when it comes to sleep and nutrition in his training. But his right pec starts getting a little tender. I believe it's his right one. But one of his pecs starts getting a little bit tender towards the end of the block. It never gets injured. He's never really strained it, I believe. But he just kind of starts noticing it's getting a little tender by the end of the block. When he notices it's stimulated enough and his training's hard enough, and the blocks that where he gets it's a little tender is usually the blocks that are the best, and we see the best output on the days we want to. Saturday is his primary day, and then Tuesday is his secondary day. Those both the days we want to be strong, and especially on that Saturday workout, where Friday, Wednesday, and Monday, we don't mind if that's suppressed a little bit by fatigue. And one of the other big markers here that probably he was a little understimulated is Saturday is the day we want to be the best. Tuesday was the day that was the best. And look at this. Wednesday, he has 6 sets of 8 between comp bench and Larson. That's a pretty decently fatiguing day. And he was coming back Tuesday actually feeling the strongest. And then you can see here we're tapering, and it's a pretty easy Wednesday and Friday workout. And then going into Saturday, he was just kind of feeling like he was lagging a bit. So going into the next block, we just added some volume. It was pretty simple. We added 1 set to that Saturday workout. And you can actually see here too, since he felt so understimulated by this week 6, usually we'd actually kind of do a light volume taper on week 1. We didn't even do that going into week 1 here because he was already recovered plenty. We didn't need to recover it all. So we added a set to the Saturday workout as we wanted that one to be fatiguing because that was his primary day. We added a set to the Tuesday workout. And I believe we added a set one other place, maybe. Am I wrong on that? Yes, we added a set to the Friday workout. So we had seen that like he was almost recovering too much between Wednesday and Friday, so we added a set there. So we added 3 total sets. And pretty simple adjustment, but again, going back to Sean, it's pretty easy to adjust for him because he's able to really kind of pinpoint what the issue is going on. But since we knew he was understimulated, we added those 3 sets and distributed those accordingly based on the days we wanted to add a little bit of stress. And we saw a much better training block. You can see here, he's hitting 225 here, where we're hitting 220 at the end of the block here when we're supposed to be peaking. And then come meet time, obviously it's not there. The 218.5 didn't go as planned, but he said he felt amazing that day. Like it was the strongest day like it should have been if he didn't clip the rack. And he had that little bit of pec tightness. Everything was in line to where he actually was feeling some fatigue on this Monday and Tuesday workout. And we pulled back just a tiny bit on Wednesday. Friday, I don't know why that's not there. There's actually is a Friday bench he did. I just accidentally deleted it. But we just pulled back a tiny bit on Wednesday and Friday into that Saturday workout. So yeah, just markers that he was actually needed a little bit more volume and was understimulated. But the opposite was occurring on his squat. So I'll use, I think this is the last block leading into the meet. Yes, it is. So ignore week 6. We won't even look at that because it's not right. So he was squatting 3 days a week. He has comp squat on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Friday being his primary day, Monday being his secondary day, and Wednesday being a very, very low volume kind of technique-based tertiary day. So one thing I should kind of start with is we knew, I mean, you can see here, he doesn't do a lot of volume. 3 sets, 3 really easy sets on Wednesday, and then 4 sets on Friday. He doesn't do a lot of volume. And so he didn't really need this tertiary day in the sense of kind of stress or volume wise. It was mainly because he had a lot of inconsistencies with technique. And it really wasn't until this final block leading in the meet that we solidified that. And now we've got a really consistent pattern on his squat. If you've seen it lately, it's looking really good and really good every single session in regards to kind of the pattern of it. So we knew eventually when that happened, we didn't need this anymore. But some other markers of this kind of training block is he would feel pretty good on Friday. I mean, we had good performance. I wouldn't say it was the greatest squat performance he's ever had in his entire life, but it was pretty good. Like we were making slow progress and incremental progress block to block. So it wasn't terrible. It was just the marker of where we thought there might be something better is that his Monday secondary day always felt like just trash and garbage. He felt significantly weaker on that day, to the point that that day, in the sense of kind of adding to the rest of the week in the stimulus, was getting a bit worthless. It was almost like another tertiary day, because usually those tertiary days aren't really adding much stress per se. Sometimes they can fill a little bit of a volume gap, but usually they're more for kind of technique practice, at least on squats in particular. The issue was Monday was just becoming the same thing as well. And he actually was feeling better by Wednesday. Not great, but feeling better by Wednesday, and then feeling good by Friday on his primary day. And so we were wondering, like, what can we do to be able to make sure that this Monday feels decent too? It might not feel as good as Friday, but we want it to feel decent, so it at least adds to the bucket of kind of the adaptation and the stress we're trying to occur. And one thing is that with Sean's squat is his squat as a whole never really felt fatigued. What felt fatigued when we kind of really pushed hard would be his lower back, but his legs would feel really fresh. And that was actually kind of one of the issues we ran into going into the meet, is we tapered off squat, but we tapered off kind of the leg volume a bit too much, and his legs just didn't feel like they had the pop on that Saturday that we thought they would, because his legs always would feel fresh. That kind of goes back to the more or less volume. He actually needs more volume on his legs, less volume on his back, in the sense of kind of what it comes from the squats. So what we did moving forward is we are now doing 2 days a week frequency. We'll actually look here, because that was an introductory week. When we added a little bit of volume, it's a little misconstrued here. So on his primary day, we have 4 total sets. Before we also had 4 total sets. And then on this secondary day, it looks like there's 5 total sets, but we're actually doing clusters. Just to keep technique and good quality reps, we're doing 4x4 clusters, even though it's programmed at the same weight we do 2x8, but that's getting kind of diving into this program too much. Either way, it's pretty similar volume. And honestly, I'm going to kind of explain a little bit after this that we might actually up that a little bit based on kind of the feedback we got this block. But it's pretty similar volume. But what you can see here is before, we had 4 sets of belt squats and then 4 sets of Bulgarian split squats. Something we found with Bulgarian split squats, we actually think that may have been a bit of an overload on his adductors, just because of the way he squats and then he sumo deadlifts. He gets a lot of wear and tear on his adductors already. And we were continually seeing on Monday kind of his adductors being kind of overly sore, if not a little bit of pain in one of them. So we think Bulgarian split squats contributed to that because of kind of how they're biasing a bit more in the adductor versus belt squats. So what we did, as you can see, we are now belt squatting 3 days a week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We took out that middle squat day and we're just doing belt squats instead, while keeping volume pretty similar on Monday and Friday. And then, like I said, we pulled back on these 3 sets here. Already, this has been a dramatic improvement. His Mondays are now feeling really good, and his Fridays are feeling even better. Like I said, we were basically, this is kind of where powerlifting sometimes has to meet bodybuilding, is we have to look at not only the stress of the movement in the sense of the squats, but the stress on the individual muscles. In the sense of Sean, his low back had too much volume. His legs had too little volume. So in reality, this is an example of both. This is actually an example of too little and too less. So we had to pull back on squat because of the way he squats, it doesn't stimulate his legs as much, but it definitely stimulates his back. And then belt squat is not magical. Please don't take this as go belt squat 3 days a week. I think some people look at Sean or like Chance Mitchell and what they do. This is not magical. This is the only person I have belt squatting 3 days a week. Belt squatting, though, is very specific in the sense of the loading and the distribution of stress compared to a squat. And so we wanted to stress his legs like it was a squat, but in a way that wasn't going to fatigue his lower back and have any axial loading. And so we are now able to distribute that stress correctly. Because Sean's not a very well leveraged squatter. For the fact of his leverages, his squat is incredible. A lot of other people are much better suited for squat, and they don't have to do a lot of accessory movements because the squat is a great quad builder, a great lower body builder, and doesn't kind of fatigue their lower back as much. But for Sean, it wasn't. So yes, pull back on squat volume, upped the accessory belt squat volume. But the one thing I'll say, and here's where we're going to have to see, this kind of goes back to the first point of, is the current block working or is it previous blocks, is we obviously pulled back on some squat volume and he's feeling really good. And I'm almost wondering if he's feeling really good because we pulled back a touch too much and we are seeing the realization of strength now, and then we might actually see that taper off in future blocks. Or maybe this is exactly what we need to do. This is going to continue working great. But that's one of the things that you can't just say, okay, this is working, awesome. We're going to keep doing this forever. There's other things that are variables here. We used to squat more, we used to belt squat less. Now we're belt squatting more and we're squatting less in the sense of volume. We're going to have to see if this progress continues and kind of how he feels week 4. And there very well may be a slight little bump to volume that we do next block on set count. Because in reality, his total tonnage is actually, let's see here. Yeah, so his total tonnage is actually more now. You can see here, even though this was more of a peaking block, so reps were lower, about 17,000. His total tonnage now is more in the 18 to 19,000s. I'm sure it might even creep close to 20 here because we're doing that kind of cluster 2x8 into the 4x4. We're trying to reintroduce more tonnage through a lower set count because he doesn't do well on squat or deadlift with higher set counts. He does better through getting tonnage through that. So again, that's kind of delineating from the actual point of getting more into kind of his actual programming. But my point here is the idea of what needed more volume, what needed less volume, and kind of the markers we saw. So moving into the last question, which is how many top sets versus back off sets, or just in general, kind of peak intensity versus average intensity, and kind of how we're going to structure that within certain days for lifters, because there's just kind of an infinite number of possibilities. I'll actually, again, I'm going to include a link to article I wrote on top sets versus back off sets, and kind of why I bias towards top sets versus doing kind of straight sets. And there's multiple reasons for that. I'm going to cover that a little bit here. But there's just a lot of possibilities. So like as a coach, what's the right one? Like if I've got hundreds of different makeups that I can do here of different average intensities and back offs and how many top sets versus how much do I back, it becomes like this whirlwind of like, what do I even do? And so to kind of, before getting into kind of the fix and kind of how I figure this out, one thing that should kind of be notated is one, on squat and deadlift, I tend to bias towards just doing one top set for most lifters. That just seems to work best for most people just because of multiple sets of peak intensity for squat and deadlift, especially like on a primary day, tends to be a little bit too much. So I want to kind of point that out. Whereas on bench, there's definitely some times that I'll kind of bias towards straight sets. But if you know kind of what's coming from here, if you watch my other videos, you know that I never actually program true straight sets. I program instead fatigue drop sets, which that's the fix. So if you've watched my other videos, if you watch my programming videos, any of it, you know I'm a big fan of these fatigue drop sets, as it's able to answer so many questions as a coach without me having to be there, with the lifter being able to auto-regulate. And so one of the biggest questions it answers is how many sets we should do at a certain intensity. How many top sets should we do? How many back offs should we do at a certain intensity before we need to back off more? Do we need to back off more in the first place? There's so many things it answers. It's gonna be a little hard to kind of describe what is fatigue drop if you're not sure what it is until I get to the examples, but that's really the fix. The fatigue drops really just do the job for me. They'd be able to give me feedback. And then from there, I can decide a couple things. Is one, what does the top set versus back off versus the peak versus average intensity need to be? Two, do I want to use fatigue drop sets as a consistent tool within programming, which is something I probably do a little bit more with bench, where squat and deadlift, you're going to see that I tend to back away from that. Or did I want to just use that as like a kind of a problem diagnosis tool to be able to get the answer I wanted, and then be able to go back to more of kind of a strict structure of, okay, here's how many top sets versus back off sets. Here's the average intensity drop in versus peak intensity. And so, like I said, this is one we're going to need to get more into the examples to fully understand. But once you be able to utilize this, it makes it actually really easy. Like the answer to my question of how many top sets versus back off sets gets answered very quickly, if not consistently block to block, and being able to, for the lifter to be able to auto-regulate through these fatigue drops. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple examples here. One we're actually going to go back to is Joey, because I've already shown Joey in the sense of the first question, but I'm going to come back to it now since we're going to be able to understand kind of why I use these fatigue drop sets for him. But the other person we're going to look at is Shelly. Shelly, I both use fatigue drop for her bench and her squat, and it's been very, very helpful because she's someone who can kind of soak up volume. She doesn't soak up intensity very well, but she soaks up volume, so it's important for me to be able to understand kind of where that volume and what average intensity that needs to come from. So looking at Shelly's bench press, you'll see here kind of how we have this set up. So she has her secondary day on Tuesday, she has her tertiary day on Thursday, and her primary day on Saturday. So for Shelly, she can handle multiple top sets depending on the day on bench. If I give her just one top set and back off, it tends to not be very fatiguing for her, and she can almost too easily recover from it. You can see here I make that tertiary day pretty low intensity just for volume. So actually she has one back off and then from there, or one top set and then she backs off. But on both of her primary and secondary days, she doesn't have a distinct top set. She has a single, which I don't really count as a top set. She has a single, and then the top sets are fatigue drop. So what is fatigue drop? So here's what it would originally look like. It would look like 1 plus 5 total sets. What that would mean, and it needs to equals 5 minus 0. Okay, so what that means is Shelly has a top set of 3 reps at 129 pounds. She is going to do as many sets, and actually this got deleted here. Oops, so it's not making sense. She is going to do as many sets of 129 pounds as long as she doesn't hit a 7 RPE, or as long as she doesn't do 5 total sets. So the top possibility here for her is she could do 5 sets of 3, and you can see here once you plug that in, she does 0 back-offs. So she's either going to do a maximum of 5 sets of 3 at 129, or she's going to do as many sets as she can until she hits that 7 RPE stop. And so that's kind of my goal, is I want her to hit a 7 RPE. And there's a good chance that some people, they do 1 set at a 7 RPE, and then they can't repeat that. The next set is going to be a 7.5, and it's going to be an 8. It's going to be, they're going to fatigue from it. Versus Shelly and a lot of other people, especially, I think this is almost more biased towards women on bench press in particular, they might be able to do that same weight for 7 RPE for multiple sets, if not all their sets, and they never have a drop off in strength. They're able to recover set to set, no problem. So that's why I have this these fatigue stops or fatigue drops in here, so that we can have multiple top sets, but she can regulate accordingly as needed throughout the workout. So let me go back and so we can see how it's actually played out. Whoops, what did I do here? Oops, I went back too far from what I... there, sorry. Okay, so we can see here, Shelly was able to get 2 sets this week. It was actually, I think it was a little bit of a volume drop that week. Oh yeah, we did a, I think maybe. Okay, let's look at these weeks. I don't know what happened on week 3 and 4. So you can see here on her secondary day, she was able to get 4 top sets and then she backed off for 2. And on week 5, she was able to get 4 top sets and back off for 2. That's pretty common. There's sometimes she gets 6, there's sometimes she gets 5. She usually never gets less than 3, but it's pretty consistent week to week and allows her to regulate based on fatigue. So if she's coming into this workout a little bit more fatigued, maybe she doesn't do as many top sets and she does a little bit more back offs. You can see here, it's just backed off 10%, just like here, I back off 8%. So she was able to get 6 sets at 123 to 7.5. That got the proper intensity because we wanted to create a stimulus that was a 7.5 RPE. Once she hits that, she backs off, she does her back off work. We can see something similar on her primary day as well. We see here that she was able to do 3 sets of 3 at 137 before hitting an 8.5, and she backed off from there. And then week 5, she was able to do 2 sets. You can see here, she never just does 1 set, hardly ever. She's always able to get at least usually 3 or more on her secondary day, and usually 2 or more on her primary day, if not even more than that. You can see here she was able to get all her sets. Here she was able to get all her sets. And then kind of as it got heavier and she built a little bit more fatigue, she had to back off a little bit more. But we tend to always do these fatigue drop sets for her because it allows her to adjust that kind of average intensity and peak intensity according to what she needs. And rather than me asking this question of like, what should she be doing? This takes care of it because I determined the RPE stimulus I wanted. And once she got to that, then she backs off from there. Could I just want, and something here, going back to Joey, there's times where once I learn that it's pretty consistent, I don't need to do the fatigue stop anymore. I can just set it in stone. And I showed you that with Joey. We saw with Joey that he would usually get more of the sets on week 1. He'd get less of the sets on week 2. And then he'd only get 1 or 2 by weeks 3 and 4. And what I pretty much found is on average, he would get 2 of those middle sets. And this is something different for Joey. He was doing a top set and then backing off. So this was regulating the average intensity of the back off volume versus Shelly was regulating the average intensity of the peak intensity or the top sets. So with Joey, we pretty much found that he could just get 2 of those middle sets and then we needed to back off from there to the final back offs. And that was kind of the perfect stuff. So I just kind of set that in stone for him. So the fatigue drops can either 1, be a tool I utilize consistently every block because it just works well with auto regulating that intensity. Or it can be something that it's a diagnosis. I figure out, okay, I now know Joey's perfect setup. This is his perfect setup that he's able to be able to recover from, at least in these high stress blocks. And then I know, like I said, as I pull back, he can be able to realize strength more when I completely pull back and do more just complete back offs versus those middle back offs. So And that kind of goes back to Shelly as well, is on her squat, we did something similar. So you can see here on her primary squat day, we won't look at the Monday and Wednesday because that's more set. So this doesn't have to be every day. It can just be one day, it can be 2 days, it can be whatever it is. It's very likely a lot of times that I'll just do this on the primary day since we're wanting to induce the most stress that day, but they can also regulate accordingly. So on Shelly's primary squat day on Saturday, she actually kind of has a little bit of a different setup, and that's kind of getting into a whole other topic, but she actually does her top rep work, her top triple first. She then does her top single, and then she has her back off work. So you can see this actually, well, it's actually percentage based. This is RP, the top set was RPE, this is percentage based. But these middle back offs, I think it backs off, yeah, back off of what I would do percentage, it's backing off 6% and then backing off another 6%. You can see here, she tended to get around 2 to 3 sets. And what I probably care more about is what happens when we get to kind of the end of the block when she's running under higher fatigue, is she typically would get 2 sets. And I did this for a couple blocks and it was pretty predictable. She would get 2 or 3 sets weeks 1, 2, and 3. And then almost always week 4 and 5, she would get 2 sets before she'd hit that fatigue stop of kind of where I want that intensity to be before I want to back off a little bit more. So here I use it as a diagnostics tool. Whereas on her bench, I leave it in at all times, because in large part because that's averaging the top sets. I'd probably say more so I'm going to leave it in when I'm trying to regulate the top sets. When it's the back off work, I'm more trying to figure out, okay, what is the right combo of back off work and drop off and percentage base and average intensity and whatnot. And once I figure that out, I'm just going to kind of set that in stone for the most part on the back off stuff. The top sets where I might leave it in a little bit more. So you can see here, now her structure that we run with is she does that top double, she does her single, and then she has 2x4 of that middle back off and 2x4 of the final back off. And we just run that every single week because it was answered through this experimenting of the fatigue drop, what was the right amount for her, because this kind of just determined it for her. I knew what I wanted for the intensity on these sets, and it was able to kind of determine the layout for me through experimentation to where now I can just say this is the optimal structure for Shelly. So those are my 3 biggest coaching questions answered. Those are the problems that I really struggle with knowing the correct answer. Now, sometimes I get it right, sometimes I get it wrong. But now I think I get it right a lot more often than I used to because I have these tools and these structures and systems that I've set in place in regards to being able to figure out if the current block is working versus past blocks of more or less volume, or understanding kind of the structure of what I need with top sets versus back offs, and using kind of things I discussed. I'm able to more quickly and more accurately problem solve these issues versus them being kind of something that was really kind of something that would, like I said, they kind of haunt me. Like there are some nights I couldn't sleep because I was like, what is the answer to this? What does this lifter need? And by using these things, I've been able to make this a lot more streamlined. And like I said, it sounds complicated. It's a long video, but in the actual, once you learn how to do it, it actually becomes really simple. They're really simple little fixes and really simple little things that, okay, I'm going to implement these. I'm going to make these small little adjustments and manipulate variables at a very slight degree, because you never want to do big variable manipulations. And from there, we start to see kind of the things unfold and these problems start to kind of resolve. So I hope you like this video. Hope you got something from it, and it helps, especially if you're a coach, helps to kind of alleviate some of the years of trying to figure out these questions, and hopefully this helps to kind of speed up the process for you. For athletes, understanding as well kind of what we're looking at and being able to kind of understand within your own training why things might be going well or not going as well as you'd hoped. So if you like it, make sure to share it. I put this out so that we can be able to help people and be able to speed up the process of educating everyone as a whole within powerlifting. So make sure to share it. Give it a like. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave any comments below if you have any questions. So other than that, I'll talk to you all later.